Well, welcome to Christ and Culture. This is Pastor Jeff Short. Glad to have you along for the discussion today. We're following up. This is part two of our segment we're looking at megachurch pastors, and we're asking the question, how can megachurch pastors honor God by not getting rich? And this is a real question, actually. Now, it doesn't get a lot of discussion because most pastors of local churches, most ministry leaders, most people who work in the Christian ministry today, ordained ministers, graduates from seminaries, and church leaders, they're not facing the issue of getting rich. They're more likely facing the issue of how do I make ends meet. I think that's 90% of all pastors are struggling just to make ends meet. And the real problem for them is how to convince their church that they need actually more salary and not spend so much money on the building and grounds and all of the accoutrements of the physical aspect of a church. And if you look at church budgets, the typical church budgets, there is a lot of money thrown at the building and the grounds and the upkeep of the building and the upkeep of the grounds. And if you're a pastor and you're looking at the budget and you're looking at all the money that's spent on the building, and then you're looking at your little salary, a lot of times it's very difficult to keep a nice attitude about that, because you're saying, look, they're spending all this money on these physical material things that it must be that they prize those things over the actual personnel that carry out the ministry here. But be that as it may, that's the reality in the most cases. But there are a growing number of churches in this country, and I don't know the exact number, but they're called mega churches. They're 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000, 15,000, even more members, attendees on Sunday morning. And these things can grow huge, and the budgets can grow huge. They can have $5 million budget, $10 million budget, $20 million budget. I mean, it's incredible how many churches in this country are mega churches and how much money they bring in every year through donations. And what's even more astonishing is how wealthy many of the pastors in these mega churches are. And that is the problem. That is the problem, because we're beginning to see investigative reports. We're beginning to see pastors exposed for being millionaires, multimillionaires. Even pastors of even under megachurch status are bringing in oftentimes six-figure salaries. And there needs to be some thought here. There hasn't been a lot of theology and a lot of philosophizing about church salaries and pastors' salaries. And a lot of the members, of the megachurches, they don't even know what the pastors are making, because a lot of times in the budget process, there's the budget breakdown and everything is detailed there, and except there's a category called personnel. And under that category, there is an amount of finances, and it's not broken down hardly ever any more than that. So you don't actually know how much the senior pastor makes, assistant pastors make, the ministry leaders make who are on staff, and so forth. You don't get those specific numbers. And, that is understandable, because who wants to actually tell the world how much money you make? It's not like you're trying to hide anything oftentimes. If someone were to come up to you and ask you, how much money do you make a year? That's a rather personal question. And a lot of people understand that it's a personal question. So a lot of churches, I would say the vast majority, 99% probably, don't break down their staff pastor's salary as separate items, individual pastor by pastor by pastor, on the financial statements of the church. They just don't do it. They just, like I said, they lump it all together and say salaries or personnel or whatever, and then have this huge amount of figure. If a megachurch ministry brings in, say, $10 million budget a year, they might have a category on that says $4 million for salaries. And of course, you don't know what the individual breakdowns are, because that's the point. They don't tell you. So the temptation is, though, and this is the whole issue, is it appropriate for a pastor of a local church, any size church, but especially the megachurch, is it appropriate for the pastor of a church to make $1 million or to accumulate a multi-million-dollar net worth? Is it appropriate for a servant of God, supposed to be a humble servant of God, to be rich, or in some cases, filthy rich? Is it appropriate for a pastor to be a millionaire, to accumulate a home and then 2 or 3 homes across the country, and to have luxurious fancy cars, or have fancy wardrobe? These are things that actually bring scandal to the name of Christ. And so you would think that this would be a priority for denominations. You would think that denominational leaders would be on this, and that there would be workshops and courses, and that there would be accountability for especially megachurch pastors to keep their wealth within means and provide what they needed, and not excessively. So that's why we were looking at Pastor John Piper's article in the Gospel Coalition, and we were reading it because there's a lot of wisdom here. And so we're going to continue on with that article. Let me bring it up here, and we're going to talk about that more today. And let's just jump right in. Here's the question that was raised. Why shouldn't pastors of a growing and thriving church earn more money as reward for his hard work and incentive to stay around? After all, the church would probably suffer financially and numerically if he left. And then here's John Piper's answer. I never felt that I was the church's privilege, but that she is mine. To be at Bethlehem was a gift, all gift. The mindset that I am so valuable, I deserve any benefits that come from my ministry is alien to the Spirit of Christ. Again, that is correct. And we need to begin to go back to the Spirit of Christ and say, what would Jesus do? Like that was the trend a couple years ago. There were the bracelets on the young people's groups that would say, what would Jesus do? And that was the name of a book also. In His Steps was a famous book that has been widely read. And the question posed in that book about making choices in life, what would Jesus do? Well, what would Jesus do? Would he become rich? Well, the answer is no. He could have become the richest man in the whole world because he had the supernatural power to do miracles, and he could have used that for himself, but he didn't. He carried out ministry and, in fact, remained very poor himself financially. Jesus came to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus was absolutely indispensable in the ministry he came to achieve. And the whole orientation of it was give, 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 not get, get, get. Another word of wisdom to all pastors who might take the attitude that, hey, I'm bringing in a lot of people to this church. I'm filling the seats. They're coming to hear me preach. The budget's increasing. I deserve to have salary increases proportional to the income increase. So as the ministry thrives, so my personal income should thrive, and on and on and on. See, that is contrary to Christ. That is not a God follower's philosophy. That is not a proper attitude for a Christian minister. My question is, why would a pastor want to get rich? Yeah, that's going at the motivation. That's raising the question. if you're a megachurch pastor and you're getting rich and you're really happy about that, why do you want to get rich? I know in the United States, we have this image of, hey, if I can make $1 million, I've succeeded. Is it trying to succeed? Is that why men strive for that milestone of being a millionaire? Or is it somehow society confers a honor and respect to a rich man? They do. We know that they do that. In fact, that was one of the things that bothered me about Jerry Falwell Jr., the former president of Liberty University, when he would talk about Donald Trump, the president. Now, I voted for Trump 2 times, so I did support him. But Jerry Falwell's attitude toward Donald Trump was one of admiration, and he brought up the fact that he was a billionaire, and that really impressed Jerry Falwell Jr. And I thought to myself, why is that impressing that man so much? We're taught in Scripture all the time to look at the heart of someone, not the outer appearance. And really, we should not be impressed by wealth and possessions and someone's bank account and their net worth. And yet, people are. Let's be honest. The flesh, the sinful flesh, is impressed by these things. They're impressed by the yachts out there in the harbor. They're impressed by the mansion, multi-room mansion. They're impressed by the fancy car. We're superficially impressed by those things, but those are things that should not be impressing Christians. And especially a pastor should not be looking to get those things to be honored by people. Isn't it enough to serve Christ? So, Piper raises the question. My question is, why would a pastor want to get rich? Jesus said it's hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom. And Paul said that those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into snare, and into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. And that's 1 Timothy 6:9. Just think of Bernie Madoff. Here's a man who's smart enough, he has enough experience in the financial markets to make $1 million and live a comfortable lifestyle. He didn't have to come up with this Ponzi scheme to rip off customers to the tune of, $65 billion he ripped off? It's just incredible amount. And he came up with this con game on Wall Street, and he had this separate secret business that was actually just a Ponzi scheme. He didn't have to do that. He could have lived comfortably. He could have died a man of character and integrity, but no, he had to get greedy and go after the big, big, big money, and that cost him, and it really brought his life to a ruin and basically destroyed his whole family. It's really, and the lives of many other people beside who had invested with him. So yeah, there's a big temptation to riches. Pastors, ministry leaders, evangelists, they don't need that. They shouldn't have that in their life. There should be no mixed motives. There should be no idols in their lives that are distracting them and leading them down a false path. John Piper continues, these texts and many others dispose me to think my soul, and therefore the good of the church, will be far better off if I put governors on my accumulation. Or in other words, if I put limits, if I put a salary cap, if I put a ceiling on my salary. Yes, as crazy as that sounds. Now, if you're a businessman, this would be crazy. It might not be bad, but it sounds crazy. If you live a comfortable life and you've earned enough to meet your needs, what else is there? If you get greedy and you start making more than you need, then you open your life up to all these temptations from the devil, and he will come in and tempt you and try to lead you astray, and he has led many men astray when they started getting their eyes off Christ and on to the earthly wealth and riches that are there. What does Paul say? If we have food and drink, we are content. What more do you need? And pastors need to be the role models in this. That hard work you mentioned is work for the advancement of Christ's mission and the good of the church. And every pastor knows that even if I worked harder than any of them, it was not I, but the grace of God in me. And huge waves of this grace break over us from the prayers and partnership of the people in our church. Not only that, but while I am speaking outside and writing, my staff is covering for me in a dozen ways. That investment of time could have focused more directly on the church. It wasn't. The last thought in my mind was, they owe me. They didn't. I owed them. To this day, I know that Bethlehem Baptist Church was more of a gift to me than I was to her. So that's a good attitude. That is a great, great attitude to have. And so that can avoid a lot of the pitfalls that we see. If only pastors and ministry leaders and Christian denominational leaders and evangelists and even apologists, as we've seen recently, if they could have and if they would put a salary cap on their earnings. And they don't have to live in poverty. It doesn't mean that, are you telling pastors they need to live in poverty? No. There's a difference between putting a cap at a reasonable amount where your needs are being met. You're able to make your house payments. You're able to put your kids through college. You're able to maintain and insure a car or even two cars. You're able to take vacations. You're able to maintain a fairly comfortable lifestyle. You don't have to be rich to be there. You don't have to have $1 million to be there. You just have to have enough to meet your needs. And that should be enough, especially for a pastor. That should be enough. There is no way. They don't need the $1 million salary every year. They don't even need probably as much as they think they need. They just need to work this out with their church board and say, look, I am concerned about too much money. Wouldn't that be a great blessing to have that issue and talk about it with the church elders, saying, look, let's head this off at the pass before it gets out of control. We need to find a way that I can limit my income so that I don't become led astray by the wealth and the riches. Okay, here's the next question Piper answers. Did you ever feel like your church could not or would not adequately provide for your family's needs? How would you counsel a pastor who feels that way right now? He says, I never felt that way. $25,000 was more than I needed in 1980. And then my salary, when my salary broke $100,000 for the first time in my last year at Bethlehem, it was more than I needed. I do not assume that this is the case for every pastor, and that's true because it depends on where you're located in the nation. I remember I was visiting a church plant out in Seattle, Washington, and Seattle, Washington is full of millionaires. Mostly they work at Microsoft because they got millionaires were made left and right out there because the stock price of Microsoft and some of these tech companies goes up and up and up. At least it did. And so you had these regular, ordinary programmers and coders who had been paid by stock options. They actually all of a sudden became millionaires. So you had a lot of millionaires out there. And some of these people from Microsoft went to his church. And here's a guy that he didn't own a building. They did have an office in Seattle, but they had to set up a theater every Sunday, and it was a church plant, and only a 5-year-old church plant, and he's making $100,000 a year from the church. And when I heard that, I was like, what? How can a church planter doesn't even have property and a church building, and he's starting a new church, and how can he make $100,000 a year? Well, if you look into the situation, actually, if you're trying to raise a family and have a home and live at even a modest level, you really have to make $100,000. You have to make $100,000. Now that sounds a lot for some people in certain areas of the country because $50,000 would give you a home, a car, a comfortable living, and you could raise a family of 3 or 4 kids even on $50,000, and that's adequate enough. But in some parts of the country, even $100,000 is not wealthy. In fact, some people, just to pay their home and pay for transportation and pay the bills, 100,000 isn't enough. So he's right. Sometimes it's not enough for pastors to make 100,000, and sometimes it's more than enough for them to make 100,000. So it depends on the situation. I do not assume this is the case for every pastor. That is why I do not say that the strategies that I have used should be applied by all. There are all kinds of situations that may warrant a pastor's earning and keeping income besides through his church ministry. Paul made tents. But let us be careful here. Paul's aim was, as he said, exceptional. The laborer should be paid his wages. Don't muzzle the ox treading out the grain. So probably churches, if the 90% of all churches should not be even talking about capping their pastor's salary. This is a problem for just an elite number of churches. A lot of them here in the U.S. Around the world, this is hardly at all a problem, although there are some churches in Africa, mega churches, as there are all over the world, South America, Europe, not Europe so much, but South America, where there are mega churches. So the pastors, this is a live issue. Paul's aim was not to get rich with tent making and forego church income, as though that little self-denial were a justification of making millions on tent royalties. His aim was to avoid the appearance of wanting to get rich on the ministry. That's important. Pastors need to always keep in mind. The aim of Paul was to avoid the very appearance of wanting to get rich on ministry. We need to have that same mindset. Now, nobody's going to fault the pastor for making just a decent income, because everyone knows the pastor has to pay his bills, he has to pay for his home, he has to pay for his transportation, food, insurance, whatever. They have to be there. It's going more than that and trying to be a rich person. That's what people criticize. And I believe that's correct, that they do criticize pastors who seem to have a mixed motive for ministry. Paul feared that giving the slightest impression that his life work was a pretext for greed. Paul's mindset was not what he had the right to do with his hard-earned income. His mindset was to renounce any rights that might make people think he loved money. We have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. There it is again, or you might say become a scandal. So that is what the megachurch pastors really need to think about. And then it goes on to talk about the unbiblical theology of poverty theology, where, people think they're holier than thou because they don't have very much money. And then it talks about how much is too much. Almost any of us in the developed West is more comfortable than our brothers and sisters laboring for the gospel in the majority world. The impossibility of drawing a line between night and day doesn't mean you can't know it's midnight. If someone is starving, they're poor. They need urgent help. If some pastor has 10 times more than the average folks in his church, he is communicating that material things are too important to him, and it's a stumbling block. So here he's linking proportionality and bringing that into the conversation. Very important. The pastor, no one would begrudge a pastor for earning about roughly what his congregational people are earning. It's when the pastor, for example, of a megachurch is a millionaire and drawing $1 million a year salary from all of his sources, and then the people in the church, their average income is maybe $25,000 or $30,000 a year. There's such a disparity there that, people have the right to say, well, wait a minute, why are we making this man rich? This is not the proper motive for a pastor. If some pastor has 10 times more than the average folks in his church, he is communicating the material things are too important to him. He is a stumbling block. In other words, he's a scandalon. That's that Greek word. The Bible commends fasting and feasting, not because food is evil or because no one is starving. It's because it is evil to be enslaved to good things, and it is good to savor God in his gifts. I told my children, when the behavior is questionable, don't just ask what's wrong with it. Ask, will it help me make Christ look great? That was Paul's passion. Accumulating money and buying vastly more than you need does not make Christ look good. It looks like things are great. There is a reason why Paul said, we brought nothing into this world. We cannot take anything out of this world. But if we had food and clothing with these, we will be content. So pastors of megachurches need to be content. So then he goes on and he answers a few more other questions. So good stuff here. We need to begin to think about these issues, and we need to begin to really learn how to apply them, because I think it's very easy, if you're a pastor, to preach the word of God up there and then help people apply these truths. But then sometimes you can have a blind spot and say, gee, I'm not even applying that truth that I'm helping other people apply. I'm not even applying this to my own life, and that's a mistake. So, is it appropriate for megachurch pastors to get rich when their ministry grows? And I would say that it is inappropriate for pastors to become rich, because it communicates that they value money and they value possessions more than they should. Just like Paul was teaching, we are learning to be content. We have to be content with what we have. And so if the church is providing you an adequate salary, that should be enough, right? Because the goal of the ministry is not money. The goal of the ministry is to communicate God's word and disciple people and draw them closer to God and equip them for service to God. So if you want to accumulate money and you're trying to make money as your goal, then you need to get out of ministry and you need to become a businessman. But even there, if you're a Christian businessman, that shouldn't be your number one goal. Now, it does give you more freedom, and it takes you out of the spotlight, and you're not a role model, and you're not someone who has dedicated your life to making disciples. You're someone sort of out of the spotlight, and so you don't bring as much scandal on the body of Christ as you would if you were a pastor and you're earning millions of dollars. After all, the Bible, there is nothing in and of itself wrong with making $1 million or making millions of dollars. The Bible doesn't say you're not supposed to accumulate possessions and you're not supposed to get rich. It does give warnings about it because it can lead to idolatry. But there were plenty of rich people in the Bible. We think of Abraham was wealthy, and the patriarchs, and so on and so forth. There's nothing in and of itself wrong with riches, but when pastors accumulate wealth like that, then that's a problem. So I hope this has been an interesting discussion. I hope this is helpful. I hope if you're a part of a mega church and your pastor is seeing the church grow and the budget's growing, that you are a part of discussions with him to cap his salary and limit him all of these issues that we've talked about. Well, I hope that's been a helpful talk, and we'll see you back next program on another edition of Christ in Culture. God bless.